Okay, good evening, everyone. All those who have joined us today on the Zoom platform as well as on Facebook Live. We welcome you to yet another event in Victoria Memorial Centenary Year. And this also happens to be in celebration of the 250th birth anniversary of Raja Rammohun Roy, as that fell on the 22nd of May, kicking off this kind of birth anniversary year, as it were. And the topic for this evening is going to be Rammohun Roy and the roots of the Indian democratic self. The speaker for the evening, Dr. Milinda Banerjee, lecturer in modern history, University of St. Andrews. We are given to understand that the focus of this talk this evening is going to take Raja Rammohun Roy as a biographical point of departure and then delve into the global intellectual history as a methodological lens to argue that democratic conceptions of selfhood have multiple roots. So there is a lot for us to discover this evening, but before the speaker for the evening takes over, may I request Dr. Joyanta Sengupta, Secretary and Curator of Victoria Memorial Hall, to come in, say a few words, welcome the audience, and also introduce the speaker for the evening.
Thank you so much, Raju, and good evening to you all. It's a privilege to have as exciting an intellectual historian as Milinda Banerjee to have with us this evening to kick off the Victoria Memorial Hall celebration of the 250th birth anniversary of Raja Rammohun Roy. Milinda Banerjee is well known to most of you, but in keeping with convention, I will say a few words of him based on the information available on his website. He is lecturer in modern history at the University of St. Andrews. Before joining St. Andrews in 2019, he researched and taught at Heidelberg University, Presidency University in Kolkata, and Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. At St. Andrews, he is also Program Director for the Master of Literature, or MLit program in Global Social and Political Thought. Milinda Banerjee's research focuses primarily on the history of modern political thought and political theory from the 18th century onwards. He specializes in the intersections of South Asian and global intellectual history and global political theory, as well as in political and economic ideology. Banerjee's doctoral dissertation has been published under the title of The Mortal God, Imagining the Sovereign in Colonial India, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. He has also co-edited volumes on royal nationalism, dynasty, and legal thought in relation to modern global history, and written about canonical Indian and European political thinkers, examining the globalized production and circulation of ideas about state sovereignty, nationalism, democracy, property, and religion. Introducing perspectives of subaltern studies into debates on global intellectual history, Milinda Banerjee has brought subaltern intellectual history into the foreground, examining the political and social thought of peasants, indigenous actors, and refugees. His most recent research focuses on rethinking human, non-human relations in the age of the Anthropocene. Milinda Banerjee is an associate editor of the journal Political Theology, published by Routledge, and the founder editor of two series with the publisher De Gruyter, Critical Readings in Global Intellectual History and Trans-Regional Practices of Power. But Milinda is going to speak this evening on a figure that constituted the subject of his first book, or maybe the first of his two books, way back in 2009. In that year, he wrote a book titled Rammohun Roy, A Pilgrim's Progress, Intellectual Strands and Premises in Rammohun Roy's Pursuit of Reason, God, and Common Sense in Early Modern India. He has sustained this interest through the next decade and examined the Raja's legacy from the perspective of global intellectual history. It is therefore very apt that he gets to set out this context before us this evening as we begin our celebration of Raja Rammohun Roy's 250th birth anniversary. And that's all I have to say tonight. And like all of you, I look forward to an evening of stimulating conversations. So all of you, please join me in welcoming Milinda Banerjee to speak on Rammohun Roy and the roots of the Indian democracy itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyanta. Before Dr. Banerjee takes the microphone, may I request all of you once again to please keep yourselves muted for the duration of the talk. And at the end of the talk, Dr. Banerjee would certainly be very, very happy to take questions from you. So kindly put your questions at the end of the talk in the chat box, and we shall pass on the questions to him for his responses. Okay, over to you, Dr. Milinda Banerjee.
Thank you very much, Professor Sengupta. Thank you very much, Mr. Raman and the Victoria Memorial Authorities for this very generous and kind invitation to speak about Rammohun Roy. And already in the audience, I see several distinguished scholars, and it's really a great privilege to speak to everyone. Now, when we speak about the relation between Rammohun Roy and the Indian democratic self, we of course need to start by thinking about what we mean by democracy itself. And it should be pretty clear that by democracy, we need to think of something beyond the arithmetic of votes, of elections, of universal adult suffrage, so on and so forth. Because obviously in Rammohun's time in the early 19th century, there were no such things. If we were to equate democracy only with universal adult suffrage, with votes, with the institution of how nation states operate, we would not really have a history of democracy, because of course, there were no political societies before the 20th century where there was universal adult suffrage. I mean, suffrage was circumscribed by limits of gender, obviously, all across the world, by class, by property ownership, by race, across the colonial empires. So, I mean, we would have a very foreshortened, perhaps myopic history of democracy if we were to only concentrate on the 20th century and the way that nation state citizenship operates. We would also be excluding a lot of societies which certainly in their own self-perception were democracies. One thinks here of ancient Athens. Many Athenians did think of themselves as living in a democratia. We would be excluding the ancient non-monarchic polities of ancient India, which in Sanskrit and Pali texts are designated by categories like Gana, Sangha, and so on, and which in ancient Greek and Roman texts as well are sometimes categorized as democratia. And we would be excluding many indigenous forms of acephalous polycentric polity as practiced across the Americas, in Aboriginal Australia, in Northeastern India, and so on. So we definitely, I would say, we need to widen our definition of democracy. Now, the other option, if we don't widen the definition, would be to say that much of the world or all the world became only democratic in the 20th century. And that would create a very presentist definition of democracy, which attaches democracy merely as an epiphenomenon of state citizenship. In case of India, several scholars have actually done brilliant research on democratization in 20th century India, foregrounding the role of the constitution, of the electoral process, of political thought centering around citizenship, and so on. And that is absolutely brilliant work. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the works of historians like Rohit Dey, Aunit Shani, Madhav Khosla, and so on, who have showed the important role that citizenship, elections, constitution making played in the birth of democracy. But as historians, we of course need to think about how would the kind of longer prehistory of those institutions, of those imaginaries, of those ways of thinking, which led to present day constitutional democracy, as well as think about their limitations. What are the kinds of democracy? What are the kinds of collective politics that are excluded by the nation state and by what, for want of a better word, we might call bourgeois constitutionalism? What are the kinds of subaltern collective power that are excluded by it? For that, we need to think about alternative, longer histories, long durée histories of democracy. And that is what, through the particular figure of Rammohun Roy, is what I want to hint at. Now, if we come to a consensus that we cannot limit ourselves by democracy only to the nation state, universal adult suffrage, so on and so forth, we can look at a much broader array of imaginaries and practices that we can see as constitutive of democracy. These would include things like critique of patriarchy, establishment of equivalence between men and women, critique of hereditary social hierarchies, concern about the civil and political freedoms, including freedom of speech of the multitudes, rule of law as opposed to arbitrary power. We can all agree, perhaps, that most of these things are essential to democracy. Without them, mere adult suffrage can very much become something like a majoritarian, Caesarist mobocracy. So we need all of these things somehow to ensure that individuals, collectives, all these exist in a kind of balance of power along with the power of the state, or perhaps even outside the power of the state, ideally. If we think of these broader kind of issues, then of course, Rammohun Roy's contributions are absolutely seminal to the evolution of Indian democracy. Now, we should be careful in not being anachronistic. There is no point in thinking about Rammohun Roy as a Nehru of the early 19th century. Rather, Rammohun Roy needs to be understood in his own social and political context, as well as of generations that went before him. And by analyzing the pluralities, the multiplicities, and even the contradictions within Rammohun Roy, we can perhaps better understand how debates about property rights, about gender rights, about the relation between caste, class, and democracy, about the critique of hereditary social power, how all of these were debated in early modern and colonial India, and how all of these debates continue to remain important even today. We can certainly not rest on our triumphalist laurels that India has become a democracy, that this is the end of history and all of that. Democracy is a process. It's not a thing that can be achieved. It's always, to borrow the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida's words, it's always à venir, it's always to come. And to understand what is this democracy to come, we of course need to look at the past. We need to get a better understanding of the past. Now, because I want to focus on Rammohun Roy, it's also essential, and Rammohun Roy, more than anything else, perhaps he was a political thinker and a very eminent reformer. We need to understand his political thought. And for that, a perspective of global intellectual history becomes imperative. Now, what is global intellectual history? Intellectual history, as the very name indicates, is a history of political and social ideas. As it developed in the 19th and 20th century, intellectual history was often understood in kind of provincial ways. People would think about, let's say, British intellectual history, or Scottish intellectual history, or Italian intellectual history, or Indian political thought, or Chinese political thought. From the 2000 onwards, increasingly people have come to the conclusion that it's not enough to parochialize intellectual history, to think of intellectual history within the boundaries of select nation states or even select world regions. We have to understand intellectual history, the production and circulation of ideas, for example, about democracy, about religion, about political and economic rights, about property, and so on, in global ways. Because modernity is a global phenomenon, ideas about democracy, nation state, citizenship, rights, freedom of speech, all of these have been produced, circulated, disseminated, entangled in global ways. And it is a methodological lens of global intellectual history that alone can help us make sense of this global framework of ideas. Now, for somebody like Rammohun Roy, who is born in Bengal, dies in Britain, this is extremely obvious that Rammohun Roy's ideas cannot be understood only in terms of Bengali intellectual history or Indian intellectual history. It has to be understood in terms of the very complex relations between vernacular Bengali ideas, Perso-Islamic ideas, Sanskritic ideas, various strands of European thought, and so on. So Rammohun Roy is obviously an amazing candidate for practicing global intellectual history. And it is not at all surprising that some of the recent most famous scholars and contributors to debates on global intellectual history have fixated on Rammohun Roy and coming to various conclusions about what is the relation between Rammohun Roy and global intellectual history. For one very eminent historian, Christopher Bailey, what makes Rammohun Roy's ideas, for example, about constitutionalism, about liberalism, and so on, global, is the fact that Rammohun Roy hybridized ideas of local Sanskritic and Perso-Islamic provenance with European constitutionalist and liberal ideas. So his main Bailey's main focus is on hybridity. Bailey focuses only on the English language writings of Rammohun Roy, so he does not focus that much on vernacular Bengali writings, which I'm going to focus on in today's talk. Another famous historian, Andrew Sartori, sees Rammohun Roy's globality as a function of the globalization of the capitalist mode of production and exchange. So according to him, capitalism becomes a global phenomenon. Once that happens, once the commodity form becomes globalized, commodity production and exchange becomes the dominant, if not hegemonic form of social economic relations across the world. It's obviously a gradual process. People begin to conceive of ideas such as rights, liberty, equality in terms of the rights, liberty, equality of commodity producers and exchangers. And Rammohun Roy's idea of the worldly householder, the householder who is ethical and immersed in God, the Bengali term being Brahmanishta Grihasto, needs to be understood in terms of capitalism's valorization of the economic self, of the householder self, the self which produces and exchanges commodities. And it is the cosmopolitanism of the commodity form which in a way ensures the cosmopolitanism of Rammohun's liberalism, why he thinks about God as this universal entity who is common to both the British and the Indians. I want to complicate these narratives by saying that it is not enough to think about Rammohun Roy only in terms of intellectual hybridity, circulation of text, or even the globalization of the capitalist mode of production and exchange. We need to think of Rammohun Roy more dialectically. Rammohun Roy is not a mere epiphenomenon, a mere kind of superstructure of global capitalism or of intellectual hybridity and circulation of text. Rammohun Roy epitomizes plural, manifold social struggles that took place across South Asia from pre-modern times through colonial to, in terms of the legacy of Rammohun Roy, to post-colonial times. And these social struggles, Rammohun Roy sided with some of those struggles, sided against some of those struggles, and it is in understanding those dialectical social struggles, those which are inevitably also intellectual, ethical, theological struggles, that we can understand the contradictions of Rammohun Roy. And by analyzing those contradictions, we can better understand what were the achievements and successes of Indian democracy, as well as what were its grave absolute limits and failures. Now, having said this kind of long prelude, let me now go into some of the empirical details about how I understand Rammohun Roy. Now, in the title of my talk, the very first, one of the important key terms is, of course, the self. And we need to understand what is it that Rammohun means by the self, because whenever we talk of democracy, we often talk about things like the liberal self, the individual. All of these are obvious terms when one, or the citizen. So some understanding of the self is key to understanding democracy. In Rammohun Roy, the term that returns again and again is Atman. Obviously the millennia-old Indic term, which Rammohun translates as soul in his English writings. Rammohun, as many of you would know, identified this Atman with Brahman, imprecisely, perhaps inaccurately translating Brahman as God in his borrowed Christian vocabulary. So, for example, one of his very in one of his very famous texts, the Vedanta Grantha of 1815, Rammohun Roy quotes from the Chandogya Upanishad. He says, "Sarvam Khalvidam Brahman," which translates literally as something like, all that is indeed Brahman. He translates it as all that exists is indeed God. Now, recurring throughout Rammohun's writings is a pairing between the Atman, what he translates as soul, and Sanskritic categories like Vishwa, Jagat, and Sarva, as well as English categories like universe, world, and all. So obviously it's a very cosmopolitan imagery where the key dyad is the relation between the Atman and the Sarva, between the universe and the individual soul. Now, Rammohun Roy did not develop this particular perspective, what we might call, perhaps anachronistically, as cosmopolitanism ex nihilo. It came out of a broader, denser, early modern sphere of comparativist thinking. Rammohun's very first extant treatise that we have is the Tuhfat-ul-Mubahidin, composed in 1803-1804, a Persian treatise with an Arabic introduction, where Rammohun basically adopts a comparativist historicist approach to say that during his travels through plains and hilly lands, he has discovered that people of different sects differ in their understanding of religiosity. Given their propensity to contradict each other while always upholding their own dogmas as final truth, Rammohun suggested it was obvious that falsehood was common to all religions, a rather radical statement. According to him, the true essence of religion was morality, which enjoined people to refrain from harming each other and respect each other's property rights. And this is a view where almost religion becomes a way of thinking the social contract, that in a way religion is kind of the primordial contract through which people decide not to kill each other and take away each other's property rights. There were certainly elements of social contract thinking in pre-colonial Indian thought, in texts like the Mahabharata, in Buddhist texts like the Digha Nikaya and so on. And Rammohun might be inheriting some of those views as well. He quotes the 14th century Iranian Sufi poet Hafiz, as well as references to Perso-Islamic hermeneutics to emphasize a monotheistic worldview. Now, such a comparativist perspective is not unique to Rammohun Roy. It had predecessors in Mughal India, for example, in the debates carried out in the late 16th century court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, in the 17th century under the auspices of Akbar's great-grandson Dara Shikoh, and in the 17th century treatise Tabistani Mazahib. Rammohun Roy would surely have been aware of a lot of these comparativist texts. More chronologically and geographically proximate to Rammohun Roy is a text like Bharat Chandra's famous Annoda Mongol of 1752. In Annoda Mongol, Bharat Chandra stages a debate in the Mughal court where his protagonist basically argues, and I quote in translation, Hindus, Muslims, and whatever animals and living creatures there are, they all have one divinity. This is coming out of a context where there is a conflict between the Mughal emperor and his Hindu subjects. And Bharat Chandra is basically arguing that what is common to Islam as well as to Hinduism, and in fact to all animals and living beings, is the belief in one divinity. So belief in one divinity becomes a way both of negotiating the Mughal Empire as well as of identifying what is common to the different sects inhabiting South Asia and arguably the world. This kind of comparativist perspective of using monotheism as a linchpin to speak about what is common to living beings, not just humanity, but living beings, is something that Rammohun obviously inherits. Rammohun's comparativism, of course, is also based on a very sophisticated understanding of discussion and debate. And this is something on which scholars have not always focused with the equity that they should, I think, not just the content of Rammohun's thinking, but the format. Because Rammohun's, the format of a lot of his key works is not the essay. It's often the bhashya, the commentary, and the vichara and samvada, disputation. Much of Rammohun's thought comes out of disputations, particularly with Indian interlocutors, but there are also correspondences, etc., also with Europeans. And this, of course, points to the fact that there was a very vibrant public sphere in India in early modern times, which Rammohun is inhabiting. We don't have to look like Habermas does only to Europe to understand the operation of the public sphere. Christopher Novetsky has identified the public sphere in early modern Western India, we can certainly see a very vibrant early modern, a very raucous, very loud public sphere in early modern Bengal. Bharat Chandra I cited one example of that. Rammohun is another example where Rammohun continuously exchanges speeches, texts with other interlocutors in order to sharpen his views. Now, what this public sphere implies is that arguments here cannot rest only on authority, on what in traditional Sanskritic vocabulary would be seen as Shabda, as Shastra, and so on. It is not enough to rest arguments on authority, they have to be actually debated. And the key terms here are tarka, logical disputation, and yukti, reasoning. So Rammohun, for example, quotes the seer Brihaspati to argue that it's not enough to rely on Shastra. He says, quoting Brihaspati, yukti hina vicharena dharmahani prajayate. If you do vichar without yukti, yukti hina vicharena, it would lead to the erosion, the destruction of dharma, dharmahani. So to preserve dharma, you actually need to rely on yukti and tarka. So debating is an essential part of the public sphere. Now, within this debate, Rammohun, of course, sides with some views more than with others. He sides particularly with the Advaita perspective. Earlier generations of scholars sometimes asserted that Advaita Vedanta became hegemonic in India only in the colonial period, with figures like Vivekananda and so on. More recent scholarship emphasizes that actually Advaita Vedanta had started becoming hegemonic over other Indian worldviews, perhaps already from earlier on, perhaps already from the 12th century, as Andrew Nicholson argues. In any case, what is useful for Rammohun Roy with Advaita is the establishment of the equation between the Atman and the Brahman or Sarva, and to use this to criticize Shankya and Vaisheshika philosophies because they distinguish between the individual, the divine self, and the material world. Instead, Rammohun emphasizes, for example, he says in Vedanta Grantha, Brahma Sharbhodyapi, Brahman is pervaded through all. Or in another text explaining the meaning of the Gayatri Mantra, he says, Shamudaya Jagot Prarup Brahmamaya Hoin, all the world is filled with the Supreme Brahman. This now leads to a very, very important and key aspect of understanding the genealogy of the very concept of right. Now, today in contemporary Bengali, when we want to translate the word right, the automatic word that comes across to us is odhikar. So human rights would be translated as manavadhikar. But seldom do we pause and reflect on what exactly is the etymology of the word adhikar. Wherefrom did it come to signify rights in colonial India? And I think that one very important node here, one of the key nodes here is actually Rammohun Roy, and particularly the way that Rammohun engages with Shankaracharya. The key aspect here is that in pre-colonial India, in a way, the most important, at least in philosophical terms, the most important test case for right was who had access to Brahman. Was knowledge of Brahman only accessible to high caste, perhaps even only Brahmin men, or did lower caste men and women also have access to Brahman? And whether they had access to Brahman and knowledge to Brahman, the term that often recurs in Sanskritic texts is adhikara. And Rammohun basically latches onto this term adhikara, which it draws from the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, the commentary on the Brahma Sutra written by Shankaracharya in probably the 8th century. So Rammohun argues that the Shudra scholar, he quotes the Brahma Sutra Bhashya to argue that the Shudra scholar courtier Vidura, the butcher Dharmavadha, and even those outside the Varna order, such as Raikva and the naked Samvartya, or women like Gargi Vachaknavi, could achieve liberation. He argued that liberation was not only possible through knowledge of Vedic texts, formerly denied to Shudras and women, but also through other sorts of texts, such as Purana, Itihasa, and Agama, to which everyone had access. He cited examples of women mentioned in the Vedic corpus, such as Brahmavadini and Maitreyi, and Sulabha mentioned in Smriti and Bhashya literature, to show the capacity of all to attain liberation through knowledge of Brahman. Now, Shankaracharya's own statements are capable of multiple interpretations, but Rammohun interprets, selectively chooses those ones which favor his position to basically argue that liberation has been promised to anyone, no matter of what status, even if they left their position within the Varna and Ashrama order, as long as they worship the divine one. On the question of whether householders could achieve knowledge of Brahman, Rammohun invoked the examples of the king Janaka, the prince Arjuna, and others engaged in worldly Laukika activities such as Vasishtha, Parashara, Sanat Kumara, and Vyasa. He also quoted the seer Manu and his later commentator Kulaka Bhatta to argue that householders could pursue the knowledge and worship of Atman. In 1827, he translated into Bengali the Vajrashuti, a text of uncertain origin, to suggest that it was not birth, but knowledge of Brahman and gentle, generous, and pious conduct that made a person a Brahman. So what is happening here is basically the question, who has access to divinity, who has access to divine knowledge? Rammohun draws on those aspects of pre-colonial tradition which emphasize that access to divinity and divine knowledge are not circumscribed by gender and caste, but are open to all. And it is this notion of competence, adhikara, to who has access to Brahman, which provides the genealogy of how Rammohun thinks of competence or right, the adhikara to liberation and salvation. And this for him establishes the basic equivalence between different selves, that different selves have access to Brahman. Now, Rammohun was, of course, again, not the only person to be saying all of this, that every individual, irrespective of sex and caste, have access to Brahman. This was already being articulated by several bhakti movements, Sufi movements, all across the early modern period. Many of you would be familiar with the extremely egalitarian and emancipatory writings of figures like Kabir, Guru Nanak, Dadu, and so on. Rammohun himself was well aware of those traditions. So in his writings, he takes as his ideal, he cites Nanak, Kabir, Dadu, and the Shiv Narayana tradition to basically say that everyone has the ability to understand divine knowledge. The Bhagavata Purana, which is again a text which dates to the first millennium but gained widespread appeal through the Bhakti movements in the second millennium, was quoted by Rammohun to suggest that divinity was present in all beings, sarveshu bhuteshu, and throughout the world, sacharacharam. So at the heart, in short, of Rammohun's understanding of the equivalence of all selves is, above all, not the equivalence of capital, of commodity production and exchange, at least not at the most overt and explicit level, but the fact that everyone is divine, everyone is part of divinity, and everyone has the competence, the right, the adhikara to achieve divinity. This also means that Rammohun has a very historicist understanding of how he prioritizes some texts over others. Sheldon Pollock has argued that in early modern India, there arose a very chronological sense of consciousness where scholars distinguish between older and newer discourses, Prachina, Prachinayunani, Navina, Atinavina, Adhunika, and so on. We find that similarly in early modern Bengal as well, in texts like Chaitanya Charitamrita, which differentiates between older and more recent Adhunik texts. We find this in Rammohun as well, that he creates chronology, often saying that ancient texts have a more emancipatory viewpoint, or sometimes not. I mean, sometimes with the Bhakti movements, early modern texts have a more emancipatory viewpoint to argue his emancipatory consciousness. Now, what ties this epistemological frame of emphasizing at the heart of equivalence, the accessibility to divine knowledge, divine liberation, to the social aspects of emancipation, is the fact that if every being has the competence to achieve divine knowledge and liberation, it means that they also have basic social rights, including the right to life. And this comes alive in the debate on sati. So how does Rammohun justify the importance of abolishing the practice of sati or widow immolation? He says women have the right to salvation, moksha. Therefore, even after their husbands have died, they should be able to live so that they can try to achieve liberation or mukti. So, of course, there are broader humanitarian considerations in mind. Rammohun is very much concerned about the fact that women have been manipulated and subjected to immolation so that the men can take away their property, so that the death of women becomes the fulcrum of justifying high caste, Brahminical caste privilege. He's very much aware of all those. But he also links it very crucially to the fact that women, even after their husbands have died, can go on practicing self-knowledge, liberation, and achieve moksha and mukti. And this justifies why they should not be killed. Of course, there were, again, pre-colonial precedents for the attempt to abolish sati, for example, by the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir and the Maratha Peshwa Bajirao. But it's very clear that Rammohun's campaign succeeds because he has British backing. And this is true for a number of Rammohun's reform projects, which do get British colonial backing, at least partly, if not always wholly, which has sometimes led scholars to ignore the indigenous vernacular sources of rights consciousness, not just the rights about adhikara to divinity, but also more material, more tangible rights consciousness, which Rammohun is inheriting. So for example, I mean, in Rammohun's understanding, property rights are a very crucial linchpin of ethical, moral, political, social autonomy. And he especially fights to improve the property rights of women, particularly given the context of high caste women. But again, he's not somebody who is doing it for the first time. If we look at the Chondi Mongol tradition, which is a very vibrant vernacular tradition in Bengali between the 15th and 18th century, there are very sophisticated discourses on an ideology of market, hat, ethic, where the rights of people of the Hatua, literally those engaged with the market, especially of lower caste origin and including women, were upheld against the claims of higher caste men to appropriate goods without paying money. If we look at treatises like Kritibash Ojha's 15th century Bengali Ramayana, Kashiram Das's late 16th, early 17th century Bengali Mahabharata, the Rajmala genealogy of Tripura, the 18th century writings of Ram Prasad, and Persian, as well as Bengali chronicles of the 18th and early 19th century, all of them stressed on property rights, the right to life, and for women, the right not to be sexually violated as entitlements which rulers had to preserve. If rulers deprived people of these rights, if rulers took away people's property, people's lives, if they sexually violated women, and the term for people here, which recurs in many of these texts, for example, the Rajmala genealogy is a very good example, the term for people is loka or praja, or sometimes the term which is used is others, para. If people, if rulers deprive people or others of these things, then they ran the risk of being dethroned. And with the Rajmala case of Tripura, we actually have a very continuous chronicle tradition which shows successive rulers being deprived of their thrones and being bumped off, killed, because they were doing things which the people thought was tyrannical. So Rammohun Roy draws upon many of these traditions. He, of course, draws upon the very sophisticated system of agrarian rights, which was integral to the Mughal Islamic hegemony as well. So, for example, Rammohun critiques the permanent settlement, which transferred absolutist landlord rights to the zamindars and challenged the customary rights of cultivators by arguing that the cultivators in pre-colonial Mughal India, especially the Kutkash riots, had privileges to their land. They could not just be removed from land as the permanent settlement intended by creating a very capitalist agrarian landlordism. Rammohun valorized the panchayat system. We all know that in various forms across pre-colonial South Asia, we have rural community self-governance, which often in northern India, but also sometimes elsewhere, is called the panchayat. Rammohun cites this as an example of how 19th century governmental reform should take place, in evidence he gives to the authorities in Britain during the discussions preceding the renewal of the English East India Company's charter in 1833. He thinks that the panchayati system can be a model of how to ensure greater participation of the ruled in the judicial jury apparatus. Rammohun is also very much an inhabitant of late Mughal India and is very concerned about the kind of complex system of rights, obligations, which were in place in Mughal India and now were being transformed by the British. So one thing he says to the British is that he says, because the British were trying to impose forms of press censorship in early 19th century India. And Rammohun says, do you know what will happen if you do press censorship? And he takes the example of the Mughal Empire. He says that because the late Mughal Empire had tried to take away the civil and religious rights of the people, civil and religious rights is a direct phrase used by him. This is what led to the Sikh and Maratha rebellions, which of course you know took place between the late 17th and 18th century. As recent scholarship has underlined, Sikh and Maratha discourses did produce very rich discourses about the rights of the common people and about the right to resistance, or the duty to resistance, perhaps, if rulers took away those rights. And Rammohun is aware of all those strands. And perhaps it is not a coincidence that Rammohun, at a religious level, positively evaluates Nanak, the founder of the Sikh movement, as a model monotheist, and at a political level, supports the Sikh fight for liberties. And again, this is again not something unique to Rammohun. If one looks at Vaishnava texts, one often finds how the Vaishnava city dwellers' rights, the term for city dweller being Nagariya in the Vaishnava text, were often defended against ruling elites. We find it in texts like Honor the Mongol. We find structures of petitioning the ruler for redress of grievances. In Bengal, the terms most commonly used were Gohari and Ardash, Ardash deriving from the Persian Arsdash. So there were complex systems through which people would petition the rulers to redress their grievances and revolt against the ruler if it was felt that the ruler was not doing enough for them. Rammohun inherits all of these. He's part of this early modern ecumene, this political system, which inherits and then tells the British, look what happens when you take away the civil and religious freedoms of the people by things like press censorship and so on, or even by spreading missionary proselytization too aggressively. And this is again something, of course, which shows the pre-colonially embedded model of distributive power which Rammohun invokes. Rammohun is also acutely conscious of the racial segregation of power in colonial India. And hence, in an appeal to the British King in Council, he celebrates the Mughals for having allowed Indians to the highest offices of state as governors of provinces and commanders of army, as advisors to the ruler, I quote, without disqualification or degradation or degrading distinction on account of their religion or the place of their birth, unquote. Rammohun also praised the Mughals for giving large grants of land, including revenue, free grants, and salaries to Indians. So a pre-colonially embedded model of distributive and participatory power came in handy to critique modern British forms of racial exclusion, which prevented Indians from achieving high state power. And finally, at the level of international law, Rammohun was against much of the forms of restricted state sovereignty and looked to a more Asian kind of sphere of circulation of people. In a very famous letter to Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, he argued that there had been free mobility of travel in Asia. Asia is a category that he uses, and that Europeans should remove restrictions on travel between countries since, and I quote, all mankind are one great family of which numerous nations and tribes now exist, are only various branches. Now, all of this might show a very kind of happy, versatile democracy that Rammohun inherits, right of equivalence of divine worship, property rights, equivalence between people across gender and caste, right of people to protest if their civil and religious rights are taken away. Seems a very happy story. But in fact, again, the story is more complex. Rammohun clearly valorized some rights and some forms of rights, namely especially individual rights, over other forms of rights, meaning collective rights. He emphasized high caste Brahminical understandings of rights, Shankaracharya, Adhikara, all those categories, over customary rights enjoined by non-Brahminical, what we would today call Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi communities. This is clear in his discourses on women's rights, which are embedded in Sanskritic texts and colonial ideologies of legal reform, and completely ignored the more liberal customary practices prevalent among non-Brahminical groups in this period, among peasant, pastoral, and forest or fishing-oriented communities, for example. As several scholars have shown, especially pioneering post-colonial feminist scholars have shown, among these communities, practices of widow remarriage, divorce, adult marriage, and bride price rather than dowry were often far more common. Women often had greater sexual freedom than among Brahminical communities. Rammohun generally ignored these alternative models of freedom by focusing on Sanskrit texts. But since these models left their imprint on religious legends, Rammohun could not altogether keep them out of his horizon. He wrote disparagingly about legends and practices of Vaishnava, Shaiva, and Shakta Tantric origin, which were grounded in free sexual association between men and women. This is especially the case with a lot of Vaishnava songs, which Rammohun says, these are very obscene because they talk about free sexual intercourse between men and women. He thinks of them as indecent song and dance. He's very kind of what we would call heteronormative in his understanding of sexuality. So things like the relationship between